Welcome to the Cognitive Crucible, produced by the Information Professionals Association. Our website is information-professionals.org, where you can find links and information about today's conversation and get access to members-only content. Join John Bicknell and explore all aspects of our generational challenge, cognitive security. The Cognitive Crucible is a forum that presents different perspectives and emerging thought leadership related to the information environment. The opinions expressed by guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views of or endorsement by the Information Professionals Association.
Hello, this is John Bicknell. We are releasing this episode on Tuesday, March the 8th, 2022. And the reason why I'm telling you this is because you are running out of time to register for tomorrow's first ever IPA members only social and live Cognitive Crucible podcast recording session. That's right. Tomorrow, March the 9th, 2022, from 1800 to 1930 Eastern, that's 6 p.m. to 7:30 p.m. East Coast time, we will be having a live Cognitive Crucible podcast recording session and IPA members only social and icebreaker. And we hope that this will be the first of many such gatherings for the information professionals community. So, as I mentioned, after a short icebreaker, we will be having a panel discussion, which will be recorded, led by Mr. Austin Branch, one of the founding board members of the Information Professionals Association. And I'm really pleased to announce that joining Austin will be Lieutenant General Lori Reynolds, United States Marine Corps retired. Before she retired very recently, she was the Deputy Commandant for Information at the headquarters of the United States Marine Corps. There may be some other surprise guests as well, but you will have to join us tomorrow night in order to find out who those people are. The primary topic will be the upcoming April 2022 Phoenix Challenge Conference, which is the United States Department of Defense's premier convening event hosted by the Office of the Secretary of Defense for Policy. And IPA is very proud to co-host this year's Phoenix Challenge with the University of Maryland's Applied Research Lab for Intelligence and Security, also known as ARLIS. And this is all in partnership with OUSD Policy and OUSD Research and Engineering as the DoD sponsors and co-chairs. So after the panel sketches out the conference agenda, there will be plenty of time for the virtual Zoom audience to ask questions of the panelists and to one another. So if you're an information professional, you don't want to miss out on this event. Please hit the event registration link below, link in the show notes. And after you register and before tomorrow's start time, you will receive information about how to join the conference. So this is for IPA members only. And if you're not already an IPA member, and if you're getting value from these Cognitive Crucible podcasts, then I can think of no better time than right now to join our growing community and support our mission. As I said, links in the show notes. And now on to today's discussion. I have two guests with me today on the Cognitive Crucible. First is Captain Nick Starck, who is an Army cyber officer currently assigned as a research scientist at the Army Cyber Institute. His research focuses on information warfare and data privacy. Also joining us is Captain David Bierbrauer, who is a signal officer in the U.S. Army. He earned a Master of Science in Engineering degree for Applied Mathematics and Statistics from the Johns Hopkins University in 2021, and he is also a data engineer and data scientist at the Army Cyber Institute. Dave and Nick, welcome to the Cognitive Crucible.
Thanks for having us.
John, yeah, thank you.
The conversation that I would like to have with you two today is about a recent article that you co-authored called Understanding and Mitigating Vulnerabilities in the Military Use of AI. Why did you write this article?
Yeah, thanks. So we just started seeing a trend where AI is starting to impact daily life in many ways, both seen and unseen. And the military is really no exception to this trend. So Dave and I were both down at a conference where there was a lot of discussion about uses for AI and machine learning in the military. But missing from that conversation was a lot of understanding of the risks that are associated with those technologies. Since this was an area we both studied in school pretty recently, We wanted to try to bring that academic understanding of the risks and the adversarial methods and bring it out into a broader audience so that they can understand the risks associated with these technologies.
Yeah, I have to agree with everything that Nick said there. I started doing some more studying on AI and machine learning through graduate school, knowing I'd be coming to do some cyber research. So it just all kind of came together, like Nick said, when we were at the conference, we heard all the buzzwords.
Yeah, so really what we were hoping people would come away from the article with was just like a general model, mental model for how to approach understanding the risks when we start talking about these new technologies, because AI is like any other tool, right? It's got both benefits and risks or drawbacks. And if we're trying to operationalize it, we need to understand both sides.
Right. Okay. And I should have mentioned this. Of course, there's a link to this article in the show notes. Could one of you talk about what you perceive are the roles of AI and machine learning in strategic competition, and also how you think that AI creates advantage?
So I think it's AI, machine learning tools. They're really just more of a supporting role in strategic advantage and everything. It's there to enhance your decision-making process, whether it's national policy, whether it's military. It should be there to help enhance those decisions. You can sift through vast amounts of data much more efficiently using these models. So rather than an individual, let's say, scanning through an Excel spreadsheet trying to find connections, you can use an AI to help you do that, come to maybe better decisions, hopefully.
I think taking it from the macro perspective to AI, like we said at the top, is starting to influence just everything about daily life. And as a result, it's going to change the environment that we're operating in pretty fundamental ways. So if you think about the information environment and how people get our news and information and interact with the world, that's all being shaped by algorithms that promote certain types of content and downrank others. So how we think about things like operational security and route navigation and all the operational impacts that stem from these algorithms and what they're predicting is going to shape how we need to understand our world and how we interact in the operational environment and how we approach strategic competition.
Yeah, not to make too much of like a sci-fi point, but we really are getting cyborged with the AI being integrated into our lives increasingly. I mean, 30 years ago, when I was much younger, I didn't have an iPhone to help me get around from place to place. I didn't have my phone, which stored phone numbers for my friends and family. And I, just remembered how to do a lot more stuff without the assistance of, a navigation system or, a phone memory bank. And consequently, those types of skills have atrophied. Now, I'm a little bit older too, so maybe my memory is not quite what it used to be as well. But I suspect that a large part of that capability, my own personal land nav capability, has been outsourced to GPS technology, and there's probably a dozen other capabilities that are so seamlessly integrated into my life today that it's like the proverbial fish in a fishbowl. It's like so much integrated that I can't even describe how much AI is part of my moment-to-moment decision making. Would you guys say that that's fair?
Yeah, I think that's a pretty great point. So as we think about how integrated these devices and these technologies are starting to be in our daily life and how we extend that to things like operational security, right? I think forces are starting to understand that you shouldn't have your phone on you as you're moving around the battlefield, right? But now we see operational examples. There was a great Vice article about how they were identifying troop movements in Ukraine using Google Maps. And if you read the text of the article, it wasn't because forces were carrying phones with them. It was because the algorithm predicts a certain number of phones will be on those roads. And when it didn't see phones, it interpreted that as a traffic jam. So it was almost a negative inference. So, as we start thinking about how do you plan for operational security, we have this, kind of simple understanding we shouldn't have our phones. But when you start thinking about AI and the role it's playing in the information environment, it just gets that much more complicated.
Is that something from like a recent example from the current Ukraine war?
Yeah, so that was a recent example. And then we also see the reaction to with Google and limiting the use of those technologies inside Ukraine. But yeah, I can send you the link to that article as well.
Yeah, that would be great. I think critical to the remainder of this conversation is a concept of adversarial methods. Could one of you just give a quick 101 on what you mean just by the term adversarial methods? And then I think you've got some examples and we can walk through those as well.
Yeah, so I guess a simple definition of that is it's the study of different ways to attack or influence artificial intelligence or machine learning models. So in a similar sense of how you do in the military, like battle drills to get after a certain defensive position, it's, how do we craft something that can break these models and get it to do what we want or learn what we want.
So understanding adversarial methods is a way of managing overall AI risk. Would you say that that's about right?
I think it's a way to conceptualize the different types of attacks. And by understanding those different types of attacks and when and where they can occur and with what resources, you can then develop better mitigations to defend against those attacks.
I see. Okay. So you guys mentioned 4 different adversarial methods. There's poisoning, evasion, reverse engineering, and inference attacks. Could we just go down and hit them all and tell us about each one, and maybe if an example comes to mind as well?
So I'll just maybe take a second to frame this. So as we were thinking about writing the article, we kind of had a running example in our mind, which might be useful for the audience to kind of understand where we're going through. As we build kind of a machine learning or AI pipeline, maybe an example is like target identification. So if you have some artificial intelligence that's trying to classify whether or not some image is an enemy vehicle, as an example, and then we can kind of step through each of the phases of training that, and then the associated attacks, which we tried to lay out kind of in sequence.
Excellent.
Yeah, so I'll go ahead and talk a little bit about poisoning. So this kind of occurs at the very beginning of you building your AI model. It aims to target your data that you're using. So in the framework Nick outlined there, so let's say we have a bunch of images of a tank, and we want, let's say it's our model, we want it to be able to identify certain vehicles and discriminate, this is a tank, this is not a tank. What the adversary would want to do is, kind of change maybe some pixels or give us some, let's paint red stars on our vehicles that we're using. So that way their model trains to identify, oh, big red star means this is a tank or something like that. And then when we go to employ it, our model is going to see that big red star and think, oh, that's a tank, when suddenly now it's painted on a bus with civilians in it or something like that. So poisoning is just that. It attacks the data used to create your model.
So the next phase or the next attack is evasion. So this is pretty closely related to poisoning, but targets a model that's already been trained. So as Dave just laid out, poisoning targets the model as it's trying to learn what it's supposed to understand, whereas evasion, an adversary is attacking that understanding. So in Dave's example, we have this model that now has learned to identify whether something is a tank or not. And it, took a look at a set of images or some kind of other set of data and built this conception of what a tank should look like. In Evasion, what the adversary would do, instead of trying to poison that data before training, you try to poison it or manipulate what you're doing in operation. So an example, like we could see in the recent conflict in Ukraine, a lot of the Russian vehicles had bright white Z's painted on the side. So as an example, if we had some model that was trained on all of these images of Russian vehicles, and then all of a sudden the operation starts, and now there's all these vehicles with white Z's on the side, our model might not be able to understand that that's a feature or that that is still a Russian vehicle. So it might result in the model misunderstanding and misapplying its understanding of what a vehicle looks like or an adversary vehicle looks like.
Yeah. So and I mean, this can get really devious too, right? An adversary can deliberately poison data in order to evade detection later.
Yeah, and it's important to understand too that this can be both in ways that humans can see and recognize, and ways that only a computer would understand, right? So the bright white Z or kind of some of those kinds of features, that's easy for us as humans to understand. But for a computer, changing a set of subtle pixels will change its understanding of what that image is, even though it might look exactly the same to us as humans. So this can get, to your point about being devious, it can be quite devious.
So poisoning and evasion are, you could think of it almost as like opposite sides of the same coin. But context really matters here, and it really starts getting complicated when someone considers, well, who or what is it that is that is potentially going to be getting fooled? Are you talking about trying to fool humans directly, or are you trying to fool sensors, which then fool humans? Do you get what I'm asking about the context there?
Yeah, so fundamentally, you can think about it kind of in phases or operational context is one dimension. So poisoning, would happen in an operational context, maybe like competition or crisis. When you're in training, you're preparing for deployment, right? Whereas evasion is going to happen in crisis into conflict, where those models are actually being deployed into operation. But yeah, you're absolutely right that there's also the context that is, what are you trying to target? So the techniques that we would need to maybe employ, in a traditional military deception context, I'm trying to fool an adversary's military intelligence analyst. Whereas now in this AI context, what we're trying to fool is a model, right? And the techniques and sources of data are going to be fundamentally different if I'm trying to fool that individual or if I'm trying to fool that model.
Boy, there's a lot to think through with this. All right, well, maybe we could move on to the next item, reverse engineering. Could one of you talk a little bit about that risk area?
Yeah, so reverse engineering is, stems from, trying to get a program, figure out how it was coded. So it's the sort of same thing with your AI model. So what I'm thinking about here is somebody's deployed a model. It's making decisions. Maybe it's pretty good. I want to know how to get that model for my own use. Could be a use case there. So can I sort of take the output of something and recreate the original decision engine or something like that? So I'm probably not explaining that very well. Nick, I think, might be a little more of an expert on that.
So I think, kind of put simply, with reverse engineering, you have a model that maybe an adversary has trained. What you're trying to accomplish is understanding what that model knows at the end of the day. So say your adversary has a model that you think is trying to discriminate your different types of vehicles. In a military context, it's useful to understand what your adversary knows about you. One expression of that is the model. So the reverse engineering method basically susses out what that model knows and doesn't knows about a given set of data, if that's a little bit clearer.
Yeah, well, I think both of you said it well. It sounds like it's trying to understand the decision making of a model, and that if I throw this at my adversary, then I have some degree of confidence that this is what my adversary is going to decide, and then that is a way of understanding the decision making of an AI model or a human or a collection of humans.
Yeah, so by recreating the model, you can then, as you said, use it to test certain inputs to get certain outputs, which if you think about, in daily use, you use a lot of AI methods for route planning, right? Driving around with Waze or Google Maps or Apple Maps, right? In a military context, if I can reverse engineer what your route planning model is going to recommend, right? That would be extraordinarily helpful in planning an ambush, because I ahead of time can understand, okay, you're trying to get from point A to point B, where are you most likely to go, right? That's closer to a traditional military intelligence function. But now if I can reverse engineer that model, I don't need to place as many scouts out potentially. I can have a higher degree of confidence that you're going to be in a certain space at a certain time, and I can plan around that.
Yeah, for sure. What about the next and last item as far as risk, and that's inference attacks?
Yeah, so to your point about being devious or subtle, this is maybe one of the most nuanced areas. It's pretty closely related to reverse engineering. So in reverse engineering, if I'm trying to understand what you understand, inference attacks are trying to learn what data you used to know what you know. So basically, it's a method an adversarial method that lets you try to attack or understand what specific data points or pieces of data were used in the training of a given model. So this is pretty, can be pretty devious if you start thinking about models in a military or national security context that are potentially trained on classified data. If an adversary can then attack that model and try to infer what data was used, infer classified data, that can kind of let an adversary know potentially that they have a leak or an operational security or information security violation.
Not to get too technical, because I can't get too technical on this, but I start thinking about stuff like hidden Markov model techniques, where you're not using data directly. You're making inferences from the data which are not part of the original data source, and so it's like you're projecting inferences into some other kind of a data space, and trying to cobble together relationships that are not inherent in the core model to potentially understand what it is that is feeding the model or something like that.
Yeah, so maybe if we circle back right to our running example of a military target identification system, and my adversary, I think, has this model that can identify my friendly weapon systems. If I can reverse engineer or test that, I can probe that model. Maybe I can understand whether or not my really classified system that I've never deployed and is highly controlled, if I test it against that model and all of a sudden it's really confident that that's an adversary system, that might tell me, or I can infer from that potentially, that I have an operational security violation where, that classified system might have been leaked or exposed in a way that's going to undermine its operation in the future.
Yeah, no, that's good. Are either one of y'all familiar with the concept of reflexive control? Have you ever heard that before?
Heard of it, but not as
Yeah,
expert as some of our other folks here.
Yeah. I'm not an expert in it either, but all of this kind of starts sounding a bit like reflexive control to me, in that, understanding the way an opponent decides on information, and in all of these different contextual ways, and understanding it to a certain to such an extent that you have a reasonable level of confidence to know what your opponent is going to do before you even stimulate your opponent. So if you say it's like the whole thing, like if I'm sitting face to face with you and I wave my fingers in front of your eyeballs like really closely, then I know from my human experience that you're going to like bat your eyes, right? You're going to react naturally to that. That is like a stimulus, and I know that that's how you're going to respond, unless you're dead, and then you won't bat your eyes. But it's getting to that level of understanding about AI and human decision making, to the point where if you provoke your opponent in such a way that in advance, this is how my opponent is going to behave, and you can use that as a way of maneuvering in advance and just completely overwhelming your opponent. I mean, that's kind of like one of the applications that I see from all of this, like combining all of these adversarial weaknesses into like a conglomerate capability or something like that. So it's pretty worrisome to think through all of this. It's not only about being able to do this to an enemy, but I guess you could bucket this entire discussion as kind of like a red teaming kind of a discussion for the AIs and the decision making that we are developing. Would you say that that's fair?
Yeah, absolutely. I think part of what our impetus behind writing this article is as we're talking about these technologies, like I said earlier, we want to make sure we understand the risks so that we can plan for and mitigate them ahead of time, right? So we saw, a big push into connecting and computerizing all of our capabilities and systems, and then later realized, oh wait, that came with a bunch of associated risks that we call cyber risks, and now we're dealing with all those kinds of implications and consequences. Projecting forward, as we're looking about, or we're talking about pushing AI technologies into all of these places, it's useful to have that understanding of the risk so we can plan for and mitigate it ahead of time. Because a decision might be, it's not worth the risk to put AI on that, specific tool. At the end of the day, it might be better I just continue to let the human do it, because the human is going to be less susceptible to some of these different adversarial methods in ways that the AI wasn't. Whereas if you have that kind of conversation around AI as just being an unfettered good, it's only ever useful and doesn't come with risk, which is not true for any technology. You're gonna approach these problems and operationalizing them in a very different way.
Piggybacking on your last point there, I know that the Department of Defense is also looking for capabilities which are like less hackable, or but like you said, still use like human sense making as the core feature of the technology. And the one that comes to mind as far as being less hackable, and there may be others, but I know that DoD was looking for like renewed capability around celestial navigation. So rather than relying on GPS, which is like, I mean, that's what we would prefer. But if something happens to GPS and it goes away, we would need a fallback capability. And the celestial navigation has the benefit as well of, being less hackable unless adversaries figure out a way to spoof the stars or something like that. But or it's like the Matrix type of a scenario where the skies are darkened out continually by clouds, and then that does away with celestial navigation. But yeah, those types of things make sense. So I mean, that kind of takes us to some of your concluding points about humans in the loop. Can one of you talk about humans in the loop and how that fits into this discussion space?
Yeah, so that just kind of comes down to how much do you trust your AI system, right? Like we do it with people all the time. You trust, but you verify what they do. If you trust an AI system way too much and you just believe all the output it tells you, you're probably not doing it right. Maybe we're in a Skynet situation at that point, letting Skynet make all the decisions for us. So, it's one of those things you have to build up trust in your platforms. So it's always best to have that person there to, hey, the model says this is a tank, but if that person can look at it and see that it's just a, car driving down the street, well, then at least we can adjust and go from there. So where we stand right now with AI, taking into account all the risks and all the new different types of these attacks coming up, as it gets more research applied to it, even from an academic sense, if we keep the human in the loop, we can start building up trust and we go from there.
So this is one of those questions where, if you had to give your elevator pitch on this, or you had, just like a couple of moments with a senior leader and you wanted to communicate just a couple of key points, what are your bottom line takeaways from this whole challenge area?
I think our main takeaway is just that AI, like any other technology, brings a lot of capability, but with that comes risk. And we need to be able to understand those risks, to be able to account for them, to build, like you were saying earlier, resiliency in our systems such that we can't be, or we're not vulnerable to attack, and don't end up at a strategic disadvantage.
All right, excellent. Well, you guys have given our audience a lot to think about. This is obviously a live area of research and of great importance going forward. So a couple of Army captains at the Army Cyber Institute doing some great research. And with that, Captain Nick Starck and Captain David Bierbrauer, thank you both so much for being on the Cognitive Crucible.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks for letting us come on.
The Cognitive Crucible is the only podcast dedicated to increasing interdisciplinary collaboration between information operations practitioners, scholars, and policymakers. To find out more about the Information Professionals Association, visit us at information-professionals.org. Please support our podcast by giving us a 5-star rating and leaving a review.